Watch a man give away a fortune that was never his. At the will reading, he named his mistress's son the real heir. His mother smiled. His wife said nothing. The dowry she brought decades ago, once worth a whole neighborhood, was that fortune. Then the notary called her forward. The Hollis house sat on a soft rise on the north side of Atlanta. White columns, long windows, a porch wide enough to dance on. From the road, you would think only good things had ever happened inside it. That road lied. On the evening our story begins, the house was full. Solomon Hollis had been buried 9 days, and the family had gathered for what Emmett called a dinner to welcome everybody home. Cars lined the drive, neighbors came in their church clothes. Cousins Odessa hadn't seen in years filled the long table, and the good silver was out, and the room smelled like collard greens and candle wax and old money that had forgotten where it came from. Odessa moved through it the way she moved through everything, without noise. She had married into this family 31 years back, and for 31 years she had kept its plates full and its troubles hidden. She poured the sweet tea, she checked that Solomon's old chair at the head of the table stayed empty out of respect, the way he would have wanted. She was 58 years old that night, with soft eyes and steady hands, and not a single person in that crowded room thought to ask if she was tired. Then Emmett stood up. He tapped his glass with a spoon, and the talking died down, and he smiled the smile his mother had taught him. A man who knew him well would have seen that the smile sat a half-inch too wide, the way a smile does when it is covering for something. But nobody in that room was looking at Emmett that close. "I want to say something," he said. "My daddy was a great man. Everybody here knows it. But my daddy always wanted one thing more than money, and that was a real family." People nodded. Somebody said amen, soft, the way you do at a funeral dinner. "So tonight," Emmett went on, "I'm not going to pretend anymore. Some of y'all have met Sabrina, some of y'all haven't, but she loved my daddy, and this here is her son Theo, and I don't want them standing in the hallway of the house that ought to feel like theirs." The room went still in that way a room does when everybody understands more than they will say. A woman in a wine-colored dress came in from the hall, chin up, hand resting on the shoulder of a boy of maybe 11, Sabrina. The boy looked at his shoes, and then, in front of the cousins and the neighbors and the good silver, Sabrina walked to the head of the table and eased herself down into Solomon's empty chair, the chair nobody had touched, and she crossed her hands on the wood like she'd been waiting to sit there her whole life. Odessa stood by the sideboard with the tea pitcher still in her hand. Corrine Hollis, Emmett's mother, 79 and sharp as a pin, turned in her seat and looked straight at her son's wife, and she smiled. It was a slow smile, satisfied, the smile of a woman watching something she planned for a long time finally come true. "Sit down somewhere, Odessa," Corrine said, gentle as poison. "I think you finally know your place tonight." A few people laughed, not cruel exactly, nervous, but laughter at her in her own home. Across the table, the boy lifted his eyes for 1 second and found Odessa's. He did not look proud, he looked lost, a child set down in the middle of grown folks' war with no idea which side he was on. Odessa held his gaze a breath longer than she meant to. Whatever else she felt that night, and she felt plenty, she could not make herself hate an 11-year-old for the sins of the people steering him. She filed that away, like she filed everything, somewhere deep, somewhere they couldn't reach. Now here is where most women would have broken the pitcher, or the silence, or both. Odessa did neither. She set the tea down without a sound. She folded a napkin that did not need folding. She looked at Emmett and at her mother and at the stranger in her father-in-law's chair, and she said nothing at all. But her hands told another story. One of them rose to her throat and touched a small carved charm that hung there on a worn cord, a thing so plain nobody in that fine room would ever look at it twice. And her eyes did not fill with tears. They moved. They went to the floor she was standing on. They went to the walls. They went past the long windows to the dark shape of the property beyond the porch lights. She was not counting what she was losing. She was counting something else. Something that was hers. A quiet woman is not an empty one. She left the dining room while they were still congratulating each other. She climbed the back stairs, and behind her the party got louder, warmer, easier, because the one person they'd all agreed to forget had finally left the room. Emmett watched her go and felt something he would have called relief. He should have called it a mistake. Why would a woman stand in the middle of her own humiliation and say nothing? What she kept staring at through that dark window, not one soul in that house had ever thought to ask. To understand Odessa, you have to leave Atlanta and drive south, out past the highways, out where the county road turns to red dirt and the pine trees lean in close. Bishop County. That is where she was made. She grew up on 40 acres of bottomland her people had held since her great-grandfather bought it with money nobody thought a black man in that county could ever save. It was good ground, low and dark and rich, the kind that grew anything you asked it to. Her family was not rich the way Atlanta was rich, but they owned what they stood on, free and clear, and in that part of the world, in those years, that meant everything. Her grandmother raised her, Mama Effie, a small woman with a big Bible and hands that never stopped moving, snapping beans, braiding hair, pressing dough, stitching quilts by lamplight. It was Mama Effie who taught Odessa the thing that would carry her through the worst night of her life, though the child could not have known it then. "You don't have to answer everything out loud, baby," Mama Effie used to say, working a needle through cloth. "Some folks talk because they scared of quiet, but quiet ain't empty. Quiet is where you keep the things can't nobody take twice." Little Odessa didn't understand. She was 7, then 10, then a young woman with a laugh you could hear across the field, and she thought her grandmother just talked pretty. She learned her manners on that porch. She learned you feed a person before you judge them. She learned you never shame anybody in front of a crowd, not even the ones who earned it, because shame is a fire that don't stay where you set it. And on the day Odessa turned 18, Mama Effie called her into the front room and pressed something small into her palm. A pendant, carved from smooth bone, hanging on a plain cord. It was warm from her grandmother's pocket. "This here holds the only thing nobody can take from you twice. You wear it, and you don't tell a soul what it means, not even the man you marry, especially not him. You'll know when it's time." Odessa turned it over. It looked like nothing. A little carving, a seam around the middle so fine you'd miss it. She thanked her grandmother and hung it around her neck, and, being young, mostly forgot about it. She was in love. That was the trouble. Emmett Hollis came down to Bishop County with his father Solomon on business, a city boy in stiff new boots, and he met a farm girl with a laugh like church bells, and he could not get her out of his head. Solomon liked her right away. That was the first crack, though nobody saw it yet. Solomon Hollis, a hard man who trusted almost nobody, looked at this soft-spoken country girl and trusted her completely. And his son noticed, and his son never forgot. And something small and cold set up house in Emmett's chest that would take 30 years to grow into what it became. They married, and here is the part the fine people in Atlanta never bothered to learn. When Odessa married Emmett, her family did what their people had always done. They deeded her the bottomland, not a chest of dresses, not a stack of bills. They deeded her the bottomland, all 40 acres of that dark, rich ground, property a bank down in the county seat had once valued at more than a school teacher could earn in a whole lifetime of Mondays. passed to Odessa on her wedding day, in her name, hers alone. And Solomon Hollis, who understood ground the way other men understood people, looked at that acreage and saw the future. He built on it. He borrowed against nothing and grew everything. The Hollis empire, the trucking, the warehouses, the properties, the whole shining kingdom that let Corinne look down her nose at a farm girl, every brick of it had been raised up out of soil that belonged to the very woman they liked to laugh at. Solomon knew it. He put it in writing, careful, the way careful men do. And he promised Odessa more than once that no matter what his family became, the ground under all of it would always be hers on paper. There was a night, years before any of this, when Solomon found her on the back steps after a hard family supper. He didn't say much. Solomon never did. He just lowered himself onto the cold stone beside her. "They don't see you," he said, looking out at the dark. "That's their loss. And one day, it's going to come due like everything does. You hold on to what's yours and let them keep on not looking. A blind man can't rob what he can't find." She thought he was only being kind. She understood, years too late, that he was telling her exactly how the story would end and making sure, in his careful way, that she'd be the one still standing when it did. She had almost let herself forget. That was the danger of loving people. You start to believe the story they tell about you instead of the one you know. The hands that once braided bread dough on a Bishop County porch were the same hands now folded in silence at a table in Atlanta where they called her a guest. The girl with the church bell laugh had spent 30 decades learning not to laugh too loud. And Mama Effie's carving sat against her collarbone through all of it, warm, plain, waiting. She just hadn't opened it yet. The dinner had been the beginning, not the end. Odessa understood that by morning. When people show you a cruel thing in public, it is because the private plan is already finished. She was right. Emmett had a problem, and the problem had a number, and the number was bad. For 2 years, he had been making deals his father would have called foolish, chasing quick returns, covering one bad bet with another, hiding the wreckage behind a big smile and a big house. Solomon's death had frozen everything, and now the men Emmett owed were circling, and the family was starting to ask questions he could not answer. He needed the estate settled fast, settled clean, settled his way, before anybody looked too close at the books and saw how much of his father's legacy he had already quietly set on fire. That is the truth about Emmett, and it matters. He was not a monster. He was a scared man who had spent his whole life feeling like a smaller version of his father, and he had finally found a way to feel big, and it was going to cost his wife everything. Sabrina understood scared men. It was her whole trade. She did not love Emmett any more than she had loved Solomon. She loved the roof over the head and the account behind the man. She read Emmett like a bill come due, and she whispered the thing he wanted to hear. Get the estate declared to the bloodline, fast, clean, and the questions go away. Push the old wife out before anybody thinks to ask what she's owed. Use the boy. Theo was not a son to her in those weeks. He was a key she meant to turn. And Corinne. Corinne had her own reason, older and colder than any inheritance. She had never once in 31 years forgiven her son for marrying down. To Corinne, Odessa was a stain on the family name, a country girl who somehow made Solomon trust her more than he trusted his own blood, and that had eaten at Corinne like rust for decades. Now she had a chance to write the farm girl out of the family story for good, and she took it with a smile. So they went to work. A lock got changed on the sewing room where Odessa kept her grandmother's quilts, and when she asked about it, nobody had the key. Her name slipped off a document at the bank, an oversight, they said, so sorry. The good china she'd chosen 30 years back was packed into boxes without her being asked, and little Thea was coached day by day to call the big house home. to sit in the good chairs, to walk the halls like they were already his. A child made into a weapon by grown people who should have known better. One evening, Corinne caught her in the hallway and stopped her with a gloved hand on her arm. "You could make this easy on yourself," the old woman said, soft as church. "Sign what my son puts in front of you, take a little something for your trouble, and go on back to wherever it is you came from. Nobody down here was ever going to see you as one of us. You know that. You've always known that." Odessa looked at her a long moment. She thought of a dozen things she could say. She said none of them. She stepped around the woman and kept walking, and Corinne took that for defeat, the way she took a great many things for what they were not. Odessa watched it happen. She stopped being invited to things. She started eating alone. And one gray afternoon, she went numb. Not weeping, not raging. Empty, hollowed out, moving through the days like a woman underwater. She stopped answering when Corinne needled her. She stopped eating more than a few bites. She sat in the old sewing room they'd finally let her back into and stared at the wall for hours. And anyone watching would have said the family had won, that they had finally broken the quiet woman down to nothing. Don't look away from her now. This is the part they were counting on. Because down in that hollow, empty place, with nothing left to protect and nothing left to lose, Odessa's fingers found the cord at her throat, and for the first time in 40 years, she really looked at the little carving her grandmother had pressed into her hand. She had never once pried it open, and not because she'd forgotten it sat there against her skin. To break that fine seam was to admit she had stopped believing in the man she married, and some stubborn, hopeful part of her had gone on believing long past the point good sense allowed, certain she would live her whole life and never need whatever Mama Effie had hidden inside. Faith had kept it sealed. Now the faith was gone, and there was nothing left to guard but the truth. She held it up to the window light. She found the fine seam around its middle with her thumbnail, and she turned it. The pendant opened. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth soft as skin, was a small brass key, old, simple, cut for a lock she had never seen but had spent her whole life carrying. And the woman who had been sitting numb against the wall stood up. Her face changed. Everything turned right here, not on a scream, not on a slammed door, but on a 58-year-old woman looking at a little brass key and remembering all at once exactly who she was and exactly what she was standing on. She washed her face, she fixed her hair, and she asked one of the cousins in a voice so calm it startled him for the name of the family's attorney, the man who handled Solomon's affairs, the man who would read the will. Silas Abernathy. That night, Emmett came to her with a folder under his arm and a softness in his voice he had not used in years. He laid the papers on the kitchen table and slid a pen across the wood. "Sign these," he said. "It's just paperwork, baby. Moves the estate along faster, keeps the lawyers off our backs. You trust me, don't you?" She looked at the folder. She did not touch the pen. "I trusted you for 31 years, Emmett. I'm done putting my name on things I haven't read." His jaw got tight. The softness slid off his face like a coat off a hook. "You don't understand what's coming," he said, and his voice cracked louder than the empty kitchen called for. "You need to sign. Tonight. Then sit down and explain it to me. All of it." He couldn't. He gathered his papers with hands that weren't quite steady and left the room. And for the first time in their marriage, he looked less like a man running the show and more like a man being chased by something behind him. She sat a while at that table after he was gone, and she was not afraid. After everything they had taken, what could a silent woman possibly have left to hold? What she carried in that little carving was about to empty every proud face in that house. The will reading was set for a Thursday, late morning, in the wood-paneled study at the back of the Hollis house, the room Solomon loved best, full of his books and his cigar smell and the big desk he'd bought the year the business turned. Emmett made sure it was crowded. That was on purpose. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the whole thing to feel official, done, finished, so that by the time anyone thought to object, it would be too late to undo. The room filled just the way he wanted it to. Corinne sat in the best chair, straight-backed, gloved hands in her lap. Emmett's two sisters, Loretta and Gwen, on the settee, watching everything, saying nothing. Cousins along the wall. Two neighbors invited to witness because Emmett wanted respectable faces in the room. Sabrina near the front in a sharp gray dress, and beside her, in a stiff collared shirt somebody had ironed for him, little Theo, swinging his feet, looking at the floor. Silas Abernathy sat behind the desk with a leather folder in front of him and reading glasses low on his nose. He was an older man, careful, unhurried, the kind of lawyer who had learned long ago that the loudest man in the room was usually the one about to lose. He opened the folder. He cleared his throat. He started to speak, and Emmett cut him off. He stood too quickly, buttoned his jacket to give his hands something to do, and turned to the room with his father's smile. He was talking before the lawyer could get a word out, and he was talking a little too fast. "Before we get into all the papers," he said, "I want to say something, man to man, family to family. My daddy believed in blood, and it's time this family stopped pretending." He put his hand on Theo's shoulder. The boy flinched. "This here is Solomon Hollis's grandson in every way that counts. This is the real heir. Everything my daddy built ought to go where the blood goes." The room murmured. Corinne smiled that slow, satisfied smile. Sabrina reached over and squeezed Theo's hand, not for comfort, for show. And in the corner, unnoticed, a woman in a plain dark dress said nothing at all. Then the study door opened, and Odessa walked in. She was not the hollow woman from the sewing room. She stood straight. Her hair was pinned back off her face. She wore no jewelry but the little bone carving at her throat, and she crossed the room with a slowness that made everybody stop talking, and she set one folded sheet of paper on the corner of Solomon's big desk. Then she stepped back and clasped her hands. Emmett's smile flickered, then he shoved it back up too fast. "Odessa, this ain't the time." There was a thin edge in it now, the sound of a man who has just heard a floorboard creak in a house he was sure was empty. "Let the man do his job," she said. 4 words. Level. That was all. Silas Abernathy looked at the folded paper on his desk. He looked at Odessa over the top of his glasses, and something passed between them, some understanding, and the old lawyer set down the will he'd been about to read and picked up the paper she had brought instead. "Mr. Hollis," Abernathy said to Emmett, mild as morning, "before you give anything to anybody, I think you'd best hear where you're standing." "Excuse me?" "I mean it plain." Abernathy unfolded the sheet and turned it so the light caught the old seal at the bottom. "This estate, the house, the warehouses, the trucking yards, every property with the Hollis name on it, it's all raised up on 40 acres down in Bishop County. Your father never owned that ground. He built on it. He grew his whole wealth out of it. But the title to that ground, the original deed, unaltered, still recorded, has carried one name for 31 years. The room had gone very still now. Not the nervous hush of the dinner, a different kind, the kind right before the ground gives. "Whose name?" Emmett said, and it wasn't really a question, because some part of him had already started to fall. Abernathy looked at Odessa. "This ground came to this family as her dowry," he said. "It was signed over to your wife on the day you married her. It is hers. It has always been hers. And every brick your father laid, he laid on soil that belongs to the woman you just told to sit down. Now, hear how it holds," the old lawyer went on, tapping the paper with one finger, "because I know that's the question in this room. This estate, The house, the warehouses, the trucking yards, every property with the Hollis name on it stands on land he rented from his own daughter-in-law on terms he wrote in his own hand. And those terms say it plain. The day Solomon Hollis passed, that lease and everything built on top of it answers to her and to no one else, unless she signs it away herself. He put his whole empire up on borrowed dirt, and he gave the only key to the one person he trusted to hold it. Nobody laughed now. Odessa lifted the pendant from her throat, unscrewed it with a thumbnail in front of all of them, and drew out the small brass key. She laid it on the desk beside the deed. My grandmother gave me that the day I turned 18. She told me it held the one thing nobody could take from me twice. It opens a box at the bank down in the county seat. Solomon put the original in there himself. He wanted me protected. He knew what this family would try to do the day he wasn't here to stop it. She let that sit. So you can announce whatever heir you want, Emmett. You can give away the whole fortune from that chair, but every acre of what it stands on is mine, and not $1 of it moves, not to Theo, not to your mama, not to you, without my name on the line. Silas Abernathy folded his hands. As it stands today, that ground and everything built on it is worth more than most families in this city could earn across 3 generations. And Mrs. Hollis is correct. Legally, it cannot pass to a soul without her signature. Then Corinne found the edge of her chair and half rose out of it, her voice climbing high and thin. "That's a lie," she said. "That land was sold. Solomon told me himself years back. It was handled. It was ours. He said so with his own mouth." "There is no bill of sale, ma'am." Abernathy did not raise his voice. He did not have to. "There never was one. I pulled the county record myself this morning before I set foot in this house. The only paper ever signed is the lease, and the only name on the earth under us is hers." Corinne's mouth closed. She lowered herself back down slow, like the seat had moved farther away than she remembered. Over against the wall, one of the cousins who had laughed at that long dinner table only days before, laughed at the farm girl told to know her place, dropped her eyes to the floor, and could not raise them again. She had judged the wrong woman. Looking around that room, she understood they all had. One of the neighbors Emmett had invited to witness his big moment half rose out of his chair, then sat back down, unsure whether he was watching a will reading or a burial. Loretta whispered something behind her hand to Gwen and got no answer. Nobody spoke up for Emmett. Nobody could. He tried once more, grasping at the air. "We can fix this," he said, and the smooth was gone from his voice now, cracked clean through. "You're still my wife. Whatever you want, name it, please." The word came out of him like it hurt. "I wanted you to be a better man than your fear," Odessa said, and her own voice never rose. "That's the one thing in this room I can't sign for." Emmett dropped back into his chair like his legs had quit under him. His hand went flat on the desk to keep himself upright, and everyone could see it shaking. That can't be." He looked at the title. He looked at the little brass key. He looked at his wife, and for the first time in 31 years, he truly looked at her, and what he saw scared him worse than any figure the men he owed had ever put in front of him. His eyes went wet at the rims. "You knew. All this time? You knew, and you let me stand up here, and you sat there, and you let me—" He couldn't finish it. There was nothing at the end of that sentence a man could stand to say out loud in front of his own family. "I sat there," Odessa said, "because my grandmother taught you don't shame people in front of a crowd, even the ones who earned it." A pause. "I was hoping you'd never make me choose between what she taught me and what you deserved." Sabrina was already on her feet, purse in hand, reading the exits like she had mapped them on the way in. "Don't any of you look at me like that," she said to the room, chin high, not one crack in her. A woman with nothing takes the door that opens. I'd do it again tomorrow and twice on Sunday. Then to the boy, without quite turning to face him, stay where you are, Tio. You're better off in this house than anywhere I'm headed. It was the one true thing she said all day. She moved to the doorway and stopped there, half in, half out, as if the exit might close on her. Tio sat where he was on the settee, swinging his feet, understanding none of it except that the room had turned to ice and the hand that had been holding his had let go. A quiet woman is not an empty one. She had been full the whole time, and only now, with a deed on the desk and a key beside it, could they finally see with what. But hear this, because it is the part that keeps the story honest. Odessa did not feel the clean, sweet thing you feel at the end of a story where the good win. Abernathy slid a second paper across the desk to her. Solomon's own notes in his own careful hand, years of them, quiet arrangements to guard her, provisions tucked where his son would never look. And reading them, Odessa understood something that broke her as she won. The one man in this whole family who truly saw her, who trusted her, who spent years protecting her in secret, was Solomon, her husband's father. And he was in the ground now and forever, and she had never once gotten to thank him. She had thought he only tolerated her. He had loved her like a daughter, in silence, the same way she loved. Her victory came wrapped in a grief she had not seen coming, and it took the shine clean off it. And there was the boy. Everyone in that room wanted her to do the clean thing. Throw the mistress out, throw the boy out with her, take it all, salt the earth, walk away with everything and a full heart. Instead, Odessa looked at Theo, 11 years old, ironed collar, swinging feet, guilty of nothing but being born into other people's schemes, and she made the choice that cost her the ending they were all waiting to watch. The boy stays taken care of, she said. Whatever else happens in this house, he didn't do this. Grown people did this to him, same as they tried to do it to me. She looked at Sabrina. You can run, I expect you will, but you're not going to leave that child with nothing because I won't. Karine tried one last time, and it came out of her bitter as green persimmon. You'd give our name's money to her bastard? It was never your name's money, Odessa said, and that was the last thing she said in that room. Here is where a lot of stories lie. They tell you the wicked get theirs, all of them, all at once, tied up neat. Life doesn't sign its name that clean. What happened to the Hollis family in the months after that Thursday was real, and real is never even. Emmett fell, but not the way the room might have wished. There was no jail, no handcuffs, no scene on the courthouse steps. The ground was hers. The estate could not move without her, and the men he owed came and took what the law let them take, and one by one the shining pieces of the empire went dark. The warehouses emptied, the trucks got sold, the big white house with the columns went on the market because he could no longer carry it, and Odessa, who could have bought it out under him 10 times over, simply let him drown in the slow tide of what he'd done to himself. His pride built the fire. His pride burned in it. But Emmett landed one last blow before he went. On the day he finally left the house on the rise, boxes in the car, mother in the passenger seat, he found Odessa on the porch, and he made sure to say the cruelest true thing he could find. I never loved you, he said, flat, certain, wanting it to leave a mark. Not one day. My daddy loved you. I married the land. He let that land. You can keep your dirt and your dead man's letters. You'll be rich and you'll be alone, and you'll always know the only man in my family who wanted you is the one in the ground. Then he got in the car and drove off. And it did leave a mark. That is the honest part. Odessa stood on the porch a long time after the taillights were gone. She had won everything, and she still had to stand there and hold the weight of a man telling her that 31 years of her one life had been spent loving somebody who was only ever counting her acres. She did not cry where he could see. She had never given him that, and she wasn't going to start with his bumper. But it cut. It was meant to. Some blows land even when you win the war. For weeks after, his words came back to her at odd hours, washing a dish, folding a sheet, sweeping a floor that was finally her own. That flat, certain voice telling her the things she'd feared for 31 years. And instead of running from it, Odessa did the hardest thing of all. She sat still and let it be true. That was the whole difference between her and the people who'd wronged her. They spent their lives dodging what was real about themselves. It took her far longer to forgive herself for the years she handed over than it ever took her to forgive him for taking them. Corinne never repented, not once, not ever. She was too old and too proud to bend, and life let her keep her pride, the way it sometimes does with the people who least deserve the mercy. She moved into a smaller house on the good side of town, kept her gloves and her church pew and her nose in the air, and told anyone who would listen a version of the story where she was the one who'd been wronged. She died some years later, comfortable, bitter, certain she was right. There is no scene where the wicked old woman weeps and asks forgiveness. She simply got away with the coldness in her heart. And that, too, is true to life. As for the sisters, Loretta and Gwen, who had sat through the whole reading and never once lifted a finger for their brother's wife, they learned the slow way that a house built on somebody else's ground gives you no shelter when the owner calls it in. The comfortable lives they'd taken for granted got smaller, then colder. Neither ever apologized. Neither ever quite met Odessa's eyes again. There are prices that never show up on a single bill, and they paid them for the rest of their days. Sabrina ran, exactly as Odessa said she would. She grabbed what cash she could reach before the accounts locked down, and she was gone before the ink dried, off to work her trade on some other frightened man in some other city. Her reputation caught up with her. Her freedom never did. And she very nearly took Fia with her into that hard, wandering life, or worse, left him behind like a coat she'd outgrown, until the arrangement Odessa had insisted on, the provision for the boy, became the only steady thing under his feet. The woman they'd all tried to erase turned out to be the one thing standing between that child and nothing. As for Odessa, she walked away with the deed, her name, and her father-in-law's letters. She also walked away with a scar you couldn't see. She had trusted the wrong people for the better part of a lifetime. She had poured 31 years into a marriage that had been, on his side, a transaction the whole time. And the one soul who had truly seen her had gone into the ground before she ever knew to thank him. She was not untouched. Winning had a price, and she paid it, and she carried it out the door with her. She left the house on the rise at foot the last morning, unhurried, a small bag in her hand, and she did not look back at the white columns even once. What she chose to do with those 40 acres next would set the whole county talking. Drive back down to Bishop County a year on, past the highways, past the leaning pines, out to where the red road turns to dirt, and you would find the old bottomland alive again. Odessa went home. She could have sold the ground to the developers who came calling with soft voices and hard offers, men in nice cars who wanted to pave the dark, rich soil her great-grandfather bought and put up something with her family's history under the concrete. She turned every one of them away at the porch. Some things you do not sell, no matter what they're worth, because their worth was never the kind you count. Instead, she brought the acreage back to life. She fixed the old house. She put in gardens that fed half the road. She opened the fields to families who had none of their own to work, and she taught young people how ground gives back what you put into it, the way Mama Effie had taught her. The soil that had raised an empire in Atlanta went back to raising people in Bishop County. The county remembered her. Old neighbors who had known her people came by the porch to sit a while, and word spread down every red road about the Hollis woman who had come home. Some thought she was foolish to walk away from it all. The ones who understood her grandmother knew better. A woman who could do that and still sleep easy was a woman who had finally stopped needing anybody's permission to be worth something. And that kind of peace is louder in the end than any name carved over a big front door. She kept Solomon's letters in a drawer by her bed and read them sometimes, and made her peace with the strange grief of being loved best by the one person she'd least expected and never gotten to answer. Peace like that doesn't come fast. It came anyway. And on a warm evening on that same wide porch, Odessa called a young girl to her, a great niece with a laugh you could hear clear across the field, the same laugh she'd once had herself. She took the little carved pendant from around her own neck, the one that held a brass key and a family's whole future, and she screwed it shut and hung it on the child. "This holds the one thing nobody can take from you twice," she said. "You wear it, and you don't have to answer everybody out loud, baby. Quiet is not empty. Quiet is where you keep what's yours." The girl turned it over in her small hands the same way Odessa had at 18, not understanding yet, and that was all right. Understanding comes when it's time. Theo came by that summer, taller, quieter, safe, cared for, schooled, steady, a boy who had been handed to Odessa as a weapon and whom she had chosen to raise up as a person instead. He learned to work the gardens. He learned that the woman his mother tried to rob is the reason he had shoes that fit. That mercy, the mercy that had cost Odessa her clean revenge back in that paneled study, turned out to be the strongest thing in the whole long story. Not the title, not the key. The choice to be kind to a child who couldn't pay her back. If you made it here with her, you already know what they never learned in that big white house. The world mistakes silence for surrender. It looks at a woman who won't shout and decides she has nothing, when the truth is she may be the only one in the room standing on ground that cannot be moved. They spent years talking over Odessa because they thought quiet meant weak. She let them, because dignity kept is worth more than revenge spent. And a woman who knows what she's standing on never has to raise her voice to prove it. She sat on that Bishop County porch as the sun went down over her own dark, rich, unsellable acres, an old carving swinging now on a young girl's neck. And for the first time in a very long time, Odessa let herself laugh out loud. If Odessa's silence ever felt like your own, the times you held your peace while people wrote you off, do this for me. Type, "She was full the whole time" in the comments, so I know you stayed to the end. Like this story, share it with the quiet one in your life who needs to hear it, and subscribe, because next week, another underestimated soul gets the ending nobody saw coming. I'll see you there.